Hello, everybody. Welcome to this virtual keynote. And today I'm super excited to talk about the DNA of highly effective engineering teams and what we know about that in 2022. First thing we're going to talk about is why are all the Fortune 500 companies talking more and more about speed, time to market, and margins? What is causing that? Why does that tie into the way that we're working? We'll then dive into why teams are reframing effectiveness and efficiency. Which part matters more now and how you should think about that. We'll give you 3 things you can think about that are a little unconventional in terms of how you can help your team today get better. And then we'll sum that up with what those DNA are. With that, let's jump right into it. So the first thing we're noticing after looking at 50 to 100 of the Fortune 500 annual reports in the manufacturing sector is that there's 2 things that are happening. One is there's this extreme pressure to get things out faster, grow revenue targets, and improve cost margins. But at the second time, if you read the risk section on every single report, there is a lot of nervous companies out there because of the supply chain, because of COVID, because of war, because of talent, because things are getting harder and harder to manufacture in a way that makes sense. And because of all of that, it's causing this inflection point in how we build hardware in all of our industries, whether it's automotive, pure product development, medical, aerospace, and defense, it does not matter. We are seeing disruption across the board, and it's caused us to rethink how we do things. So start with probably one of the most controversial. You look at Tesla. Oftentimes, people either love Tesla or they hate Tesla. But I think it's a really interesting case study because it's one company who's ultimately had 2 very different outcomes on 2 of their premier vehicles. You look at the approach to the Model S and now the Model 3. That program got to market really fast for an automotive program. It did 2 things. One is it's forced electrification throughout the entire auto industry and arguably beyond the auto industry. I don't think if Tesla didn't push that 10, 15 years ago, we'd see such a competition today on the EV race. I think it'd be 5 or 10 years from now. The second thing, though, and probably more importantly, is to just fundamentally change the expectations for delivering a vehicle to market. Companies were comfortable with 56, 60-month development windows. Now Tesla's saying, hey, we're going to do this in 40. That was the Model 3. You then look at the Cybertruck, a bit of an unconventional approach to product development, a product that potentially doesn't quite hit the current truck owner market because of the style versus a classic F-150 or a big Dodge Ram, not quite the exact fit. If you look at this New York Times headline, it kind of says it all. Because they're not delivering the Cybertruck, despite having a lot of pre-orders, people are now starting to look elsewhere. And I think it left a really wide door open for companies that are super hungry to come in there and frankly eat your lunch. So look at Ford, right? You bring in Jim Farley, a completely new mindset at Ford has been established, and the Ford Lightning is taking people by storm. It's being talked about all over the place. I hear it talked about at CoLab, honestly, on a weekly basis about people wanting to buy one. And they're going to get those to market sooner, and they're going to see return on that. And that difference in getting there for the Model 3 fast versus the Cybertruck now being pushed out could be the difference in that initial market share, which is a huge thing for market competition. And if you really look at hardware itself, hardware is really hard. And I think if you think about building really complicated software, that is difficult, but there are things in hardware that no one else can explain. You've got supply chains to worry about. You got to actually think about building physical prototypes. It's extremely difficult to do true agile because there's things that are in waterfall that can't really happen the same way you would build software. And the list goes on and on and on. But the truth is we make this way harder than it needs to be. And by we, I mean everybody in the hardware world. My background is a mechanical engineer. Co-founder is also a mechanical engineer. We ultimately started CoLab because we were frustrated with the way we worked. And we saw it across a bunch of different places. Started in Fortune 500 companies, in energy, aerospace, and defense, went into startups and medical, generally even worked for Tesla. And the common trend across all of that was that things are just way too slow, way too painful, and they're not really focused on engineering. The dream you're sold in engineering school is not what actually happens when you get out in the workforce. And a really good example, you're looking at a picture off the internet of the Tesla Model 3 and part of the battery pack or one of the systems there, and you see the connector. DFM on that connector can take 8 to 12 weeks. And that connector is one of 10,000 parts in that vehicle. And it might be a small problem, but think about that in a summation of what causes products or programs to go late. And You then compare that to software development. Imagine asking a software developer to take screenshots of their code, put it in a PowerPoint deck, send it to you via email, and then they take it down on their desktop and send back some red lines. And that process takes 6 to 8 weeks for a PR. Every single software developer would just straight up quit. You'd have none. There'd be zero. Yet as engineers, we do this every single day. And that's a very small example of all the things that we need to think about in terms of how we can be better at getting products to market. Because on top of that, the expectation bar has gone up every single year since COVID's happened in particular. Now, if it's not COVID, it's recession. If it's not recession, there's war. If it's not war, it's supply chain crisis. On top of that, every product is getting more complex. The expectations for better margins are always there from shareholders, and everybody is fighting to get things out the door faster. And when you look at like how product development was done 20 years ago versus the way it's done today, the process itself is almost the exact same. We had some breakthroughs in the late 90s, early 2000s with CAD tools going mainstream, PDMs, PLMs coming out, you start seeing CAE and the rest. But if you really look at like how we work together, how we develop, we're pretty much still in a waterfall stage gate process that hasn't changed a whole lot. People have made things more efficient or automated little parts. We haven't rethought how we've worked in such a long time. And if you look at the inputs, we've magnified that by a factor of probably 10x. And what we've done is we've created this bottleneck now that is making it near impossible to actually achieve the really lofty and ambitious goals when they should be achievable. We have gotten way smarter as an industry broadly, yet we're still not moving that much faster. Why is that? And I think the thing you need to think about with this is not just a program. Like if you think of this on a program basis, you can look at, okay, we were 2 months late or $5 million over or whatever. It's much bigger than that. This bottleneck doesn't just cost you a month or two or $5 million in budget. It actually shifts out when that product goes to market. So if you miss a design problem, which we've all seen happen late in the game, pushes out a timeline, you're recognizing revenue slower. Your competition is probably there earlier, so you miss out on market share. And ultimately, that's going to compound in every single program you do. And over time, you're losing the long game. But that's not true for everybody. It's starting to change. Like there is fundamentally starting to become a belief that we need to invest in how we work and not just in what we build. And people are starting to focus on how do we fix that bottleneck. And my thought is I think COVID in particular sparked people to think about, okay, we could work remote. We could work around the world. We don't like printing stuff off. We could work in digital tools like Microsoft Teams. But that's only the very first step. Like that is the absolute fundamentals. We need to get much better at that. But the teams who really figure out how to fix the bottleneck and how they build products are going to win the long game. Because if you look at a simple example here, same graph, same timeline, if you were able to take every single design iteration and do that twice as fast, you might be able to cut months out of that cycle. If you do that across 20 programs, the impact over 5 years is going to be tremendous to your competitive position. And it doesn't take much more than looking at Apple, right? One of the most famous companies in the world, both for their products and for known for how they deliver their products. They do developer launch events every single quarter. And when they do their big days, like 3, 4, 5 million people sign in online to see what they've launched. And it's not just because the products are cool. It's because everybody believes that Apple is going to build incredible products. And if you look at this, in 2012, Apple said they were going to challenge and push on time to market. And every year since then, they have without fail put a new iPhone out. They've put out watches. They've pushed the boundaries on laptops. They've pushed the price point up on all these things. And it's forced everybody else to behave differently to the point, earlier this year where they hit $3 trillion in market value. And ultimately, we're just a machine now that are not just pumping out awesome products, but they've built a machine that pumps out absolutely incredible products. And the difference here is Apple's not playing the old game. The old game is focused on efficiency. It's what is in front of you and making it a little better. Apple is setting the standard for how product development should be done. They are rethinking what it means to be effective so they can win the new game, which is going to be the next 10 to 20 years. And Peter Drucker said this really well. Efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right thing. And if you take a second, just think about in your day-to-day, when people talk about getting better, they're almost always talking about efficiency. I've sat down with people in C-suites, vice presidents, and the words I always hear are efficient. You read those annual reports, you often see the words efficient. The question you should be asking is, should we be making this thing more efficient, or should we not be doing this thing at all? And this is where startups really catch up to big companies. Because to be a startup and to win, you have to be ruthlessly focused. And ruthless focus means you deprioritize everything else that isn't going to add tremendous value. If you look at these big companies, we do a lot of things that if you really measured, like, does this fancy widget we added to this new vehicle really matter? You might find it's a complete waste of time and money. And we're not doing a good enough job of saying, do we need this? Both in the product and in how we work. So we did a survey about 9 months ago with about 100 engineering leaders and asked them, how do they spend their time? And from that survey at the manager, director, VP level, the average was 8 to 10 hours a week are spent literally just sitting in design review meetings, the meetings themselves. And if you think about your boardroom, when you have one of these, it's often 5, 10, maybe even more people sitting around a computer screen, looking at one person presenting, somebody taking notes. It's almost the least effective way you could possibly get your feedback, your intelligence, the things you know, into that conversation, because only one person can do it at a time. And everyone else is sitting and waiting. And then what happens is the problem solving happens offline. The meeting should be for problem solving. Yet right now, it's the only means to cover up the effectiveness gap. So when you go ask teams, how do they do design reviews? 85% will tell you meetings is the primary means for a design review. And I'd argue that that's crazy. Software developers, very similar stream, do not have meetings to review PRs. They have meetings to review PRs when they go wrong, or there's a huge problem. We default to meetings in the hardware world because we don't know how to work together effectively. Look at number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on this list. Reviewing PowerPoints and PDFs. That's because we don't know how to share CAD natively and actually work together on the actual data. CAD screen shares and over-the-shoulder discussion, a little bit better because we're working together. But realistic at this point, we should be able to just talk fluently from where we're to. And then at the very bottom, we got PLM. So one of the questions I always hear, or I'll hear from skeptics, is, our PLM does this. And we asked 100 people that are in leadership roles, do you use your PLM for design review and communication? And 12% said they do. And the answer is PLM is too complicated. It's not conducive to having an innovative, creative discussion with your team about these hard problems. And ultimately, that's leading people into this world of doing things that are not effective at all. And when you look at this in a real world example, you take a program, let's say it's 40 months, budget's $100 million. If you take the lens of just making what I just showed you more efficient, so better meetings, better screen shares, all that kind of stuff, and you do all that really, really well, you might trim 10%. So you're talking 36 months, $90 million budget. And that's if it's done really well. Say you focus on effectiveness first. Same budget, same timeline. You then question, what should we be doing? So start with do the right things. That might be cutting some part of the product scope. That might be rewriting some part of our actual product development philosophy. That might be moving a key part of our decision making earlier in the process so we don't have downfalls later on. But doing all of that to eliminate the waste. All of us have saw this happen in lean when you think about manufacturing. Yet we don't do this very well when it comes to actually designing the products we're going to manufacture. Take that, start working on each of those processes to make them all a little bit better. So start putting those efficiencies into those processes that actually made the cut from the first pass. Because of that, and because you've invested in communication, you should be able to catch these mistakes earlier. And ultimately, at the end of the day, a program could look like, say 30 months, 28, 30 months, and maybe it's 3/4 of that budget. But just going for efficiency, you'd have to cut 25% of all of that, and that's next to impossible to see happening. So when you think about this, there's a new working potential that we need, because today, teams think about this triangle all the time. There's speed, there's quality, and there's cost. And generally, what people will tell you is that you can do 2 of them, but not 3. So if you pick speed, you pick quality, cost is going to go up. You pick quality, you pick cost, speed's going to go down. And that's ultimately the trade-off that you've been wired to say we have to make as an engineering organization. What I'm going to tell you is that that's not true. It is true if you're not willing to invest, you're not willing to make change. But if you are willing to invest and actually think about doing things in a more effective way, you put something in that can go through and you can actually pull out all three of those levers into a way that is favorable for you. And we'll walk through a couple of examples later on. But doing that is the change we need now, because going faster and reducing costs but having quality problems is not going to fix you winning the long game. It's only going to help you fix a short-term problem. And right now, we need to think long-term, because the whole world is just thinking about a short-term recession. There's a lot that's going to come after that. We're going to keep going. There was a recession in 2008. There's been lots of other things go wrong. We're still here, but there's a lot of companies that aren't, because they were very narrow-sighted at the time. So the difference between the two, the teams that make very similar mistakes and the ones that are really investing in effectiveness are pretty stark. I think the first one is that teams that are focused on efficiency and like making the same mistakes are really focused on tools and technology, versus the ones that are thinking about effectiveness are thinking about their team and how they work together. And then as a result of that, they'll ask themselves, what tools do we need to actually augment and do that? You'll often see the graph or a plot where it talks about people, process, technology, transformation. A lot of teams start at the transformation end. I would argue you need to start with a vision at the transformation end, but then come back to the people, fix your processes to make that work, tie the tools on that make sense, and then you'll see that result. On that exact same thought, most teams are only thinking about incremental improvements. And there's a really good reason for that, because they're underwater, they're under-resourced, and things are extremely stressful with very little power to make change. But if you're sitting in a leadership role, this is your opportunity to start with a small piece of change and challenge what your existing process looks like, because 9 times out of 10, it's not the way you can most effectively do that. And that's what we see most effective teams doing, is challenging status quo and rewiring their existing processes so they are effective. And the last one is the mindset. How many times have you heard someone say it works, or it's not broken, or we've always done it this way? That is the most dangerous mindset you could possibly have when it comes to actually making real change, because it leads to complacency. And all of us have done it. As much as I would love to tell you that CoLab has never fell victim to saying something like that, we totally have. But it's more of a mindset generally that we don't. And I don't think that's true in hardware often. So the people that are thinking hard about this, which processes should we change, how do we win the long game, are really, really getting ahead. And I think about this company that reached out to us probably 3 or 4 years ago. They came to us with a very specific problem about how their supply chain was working and wanted to turn their partners or suppliers into partners to be able to get through design iterations way faster. They had this like really clear vision of a very specific part that was blocking them from getting to market faster. 2 years later, they've got their entire supply chain running through this completely different way of working, because they just picked a nugget and took stepping stones where you got one supplier working the rest. And now it's just this beautiful transformation that started with something so simple because they picked the right spot to start. So I think one good way to summarize this is that transformation happens by putting effectiveness first. So picking the right things to focus on, then making them hyper efficient. So doing the right things right. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not saying efficiency is a bad thing. I'm saying efficiency on the wrong thing is a bad thing, and that we do a lot of that. So questioning why we're doing something is one of the most important things you can do. Just the question why. Why is a really important question. And just like we do root cause, like for a failure analysis, you ask the 5 whys. We should be asking the 5 whys of why are we doing this? Why are we building this product feature? Why are we working this way? Why are we sitting with 15 of us in a boardroom where 14 people are checked out the whole time? Because that's not effective. So do the right things first, then do the right things right. And if you do that, there's ultimately a large upside for your team in being competitive, happy, and successful long term. And really there's 3 unconventional places that we're seeing teams invest today that are helping them get there. Because there's obvious things, right? If your team is smaller and you don't have a PLM and you're just burning every end of the candle, trying to keep track of records and change it out of control, that's an obvious massive effectiveness win you can make. But a lot of teams do today. We're at a place where we're optimizing little pieces, and we need to take those bigger steps. So the first one is talking about how can we accelerate new product development, catch mistakes much sooner by rewiring that design review process we talked about earlier. The second is really diving into turning your external partners or external collaborators into true partners through tighter supply chain collaboration. So that is not an absolute pain to do. And the third one is reducing the cost of your product by making it engineering-led, virtual, and continuous, instead of the current way it is today, where it's extremely workshop-focused, only a few people's real, true job, and on a very discrete basis. So if you think about just getting to market faster and rewiring this design review process, the part that's not working is that the process is making it harder, not easier, for your team to do their job. If you ask most people, do they like design review in the engineering world, they'd probably tell you no. And that's because it's hard, it's slow, oftentimes their feedback's not heard, or they're not involved at the right time. They can't find details. It's ultimately just a pain, and usually just exposes things late. And ultimately, what comes out of that is changes at the very end that are very costly to your company. At this point, if you look at that bottleneck we talked about earlier, that bottleneck is what's killing us getting to market. And if you think about what design review really is, design review is an engineer's language to communication. It's the same way like a developer would have a PR as their language for really giving feedback and making sure something's done right. A design review is exactly the equivalent for us building something in the hardware world. And that poor communication leads to bad decisions, and bad decisions lead to slippage, delays, mistakes, and all the rest. Because ultimately, design review is one of those places you can drive effectiveness more than anywhere else, because they often gate the next step. They gate us going to where we're going. And if we can do that better, do that faster, do it sooner, the right people, you can change how your team is working. 3 things you can do to get started. And the first one is understanding what is your design review process? What is the standard? And thinking about what parts should change. Like if you really are doing meetings every single day, or you're sending around PDFs of drawings that you're pulling down, people doing on their desktops or printing off, ask yourself why we're doing that and rethink how you want your team to communicate. The second part then is thinking about how do you really get true engagement? Because to get the people's best knowledge, best understanding, most effective work, they need to feel engaged. If they're disengaged and they're just doing a job and you're pushing them to do it, they're just going to go through the review nonchalant and not get you what you really need. The more engaged they are, the better the result's going to be for you. And the third part, which I think everyone can take advantage of right away, is figuring out ways to make design review asynchronous so that when you're sitting in that boardroom with 15 people, you're not just waiting for the other 14 to come through. You could be offline, take your 10 minutes, do your thing, everyone sees what's going on, and then you come back and focus with a group of, a couple of people in a boardroom on a key problem or challenge to solve that thing. And I'll take a really cool example. Kraken Robotics, public company in the subsea space, a leader in what they do. 4 years ago, we started talking to them about where they wanted to go. And they had this really bold vision at the time of moving way faster and improving quality while they were going through the ISO certification process. And that sounded at the time kind of like an oxymoron. Like, how do you do both those things at once? And is it irresponsible? And ultimately, they said no, because they were frustrated with the way the industry standard tools were for communicating over email, slideshows for big 3D reviews, PDFs, meetings, trackers, all the rest. So they challenged and said, how do we just rewrite how we communicate and make design review decisions? And after doing that, they put all their design decision making in one centralized tool. Mechanical engineers, electrical engineers can actually talk to each other with the native data right in front of them in a way that's either real time or async. File sharing, communication all happens in context. And ultimately, all that issue tracking where they're keeping track of themselves is just automated. Because that's not, an engineer's job is not to track issues. An engineer's job is to find and solve issues, and something else should be taken care of. What is the highest priority? Is it logged? Is the record there? That is work that a piece of software should do for your team. And the impact has been outstanding over these couple of years. The first and most important one is outside of moving way faster, they saw a year-over-year decrease in manufacturing errors. And that's incredible. Like, that was the bold vision, which was move faster, cut down mistakes. To do both those things at a time when almost no other team was is absolutely incredible. The best part is they actually used this process then to get ISO 9001 certified. And the team liked it. What other team has an ISO process that their team likes? I can tell you there's next to zero. I think that's truly outstanding. And if you go back to that triangle graph, we talked about the new working potential, they're there. You can pull data. Last week, they did 56 design reviews across about 20 people. That's like, 8, 9 a day. Most teams would be lucky if they get 2 or 3 in a week. And they're doing that kind of velocity where they're going through 3 and 4 and 500 pieces of feedback, closing them in a week, 1 week. We've seen other processes where teams can be open for 2 and 3 months on a cycle. And their cycle time now is a couple of days. And that's what's making the difference for Kraken. If you think deeper about that and extend beyond just your internal team, there's a lot of value in your supply chain, both going down to your suppliers and then also to your customer, and turning them into real partners. The problem today is that it's next to impossible to share your most complex and important data in a way that's easy to use and secure. Email is not secure. It's easy to share, depending on how big the file is, which often then you get blocked. And then once you send it, how does someone view it? They download CAD viewer, try to figure it out. That is a horrible experience for everybody. Your PLM is good at keeping it internal. It's then either expensive for your partners to get a license, or it's really complicated, or it's both. And at the end of the day, that friction means everybody goes back to email and they do the absolute bare minimum to just get by. Because why would you make it harder? And that's killing the opportunity to turn your suppliers into partners, which you desperately need. Because at this point, looking at the current market, your supply chain is going to make or break how this works. And there's more than just how you communicate. How you think about inventory and strategy and parts being replaced is super important too. But if you don't have that relationship, suppliers are just about cost. And that's not how you're going to win today. You need to leverage that expertise. And you need to think about building resilience in that supply chain so that when things get hard, you have a partner to turn to. So if you can reframe that relationship from supplier to partner, and I'm seeing customers do it today. I hear talk about trusted suppliers or trusted partners. People are doing this, but it's not everyone and it's not common. And I think seeing that happen more and then really investing and putting your money where your mouth is in terms of making that easy and treating them really like partners will make a massive difference. Because then you can get suppliers involved early on in the process. So when you get to that awful DFM review at the end where there's 500 pieces of feedback, we can't build this thing, change it all, it costs too much, that's all considered up front. That's not your team's responsibility. That is a supplier's expertise that they can help you with. Give you a great example of Hyundai Mobis, Fortune 500, Auto Tier 1, working with many of the big OEMs. 4 years ago, really wanted to work tighter with everyone across their value chain and their teams in different locations. At the time, they found it extremely hard to get the right person, the right massive CAD file at the right time. Then, on top of that, the OEM changes the data constantly because that's just the nature of the beast. You've got thousands of engineers working through this. And it's like, how do you actually keep up with all these changes if one person is just passing data out to all these people in the supply chain? And the solution is not PLM here. They don't need a PLM. They need to be able to communicate. And paying that kind of money with that type of complexity was not what worked in this particular case. So after and bolting on a solution to that, they're able to take that data and share with everybody in their internal team and supply chain in real time. Everyone has access to this with the integrity of what came from your PLM, knowing what is there and what is the latest, without having to have an understanding of a full complicated PLM program. And the last part is it started this beautiful real-time engagement of being able to have a meaningful conversation and sharing with both partners, customers, and the supply chain. And really at the end of the day, two major things happened. One was 3/4 of the time that used to be spent in trying to figure out share a file and review, completely cut out. Because now it's take the file from the PLM, put it into the browser in a secure location, invite someone to it, and everyone has it. Versus before it was take it, use an FTP, might take a few hours for you to do that and get it over, pull it down, and people can't view it. All of that's cut out. But I think the coolest part is that both their suppliers and their customer really became partners in this and had a different way of having a conversation. All the way to the point where, something like this allowed them to have a visual representation of how they would build one of the core assemblies for a Fiat Chrysler vehicle during the RFQ process. That just made it a much more rich conversation, showing that Hyundai Mobis knew what they were doing, knew that they were a partner also for FCA, and ultimately helped them win a massive contract several years ago. I think the very last part then is something that everybody can do. Because when I hear VAV or value analysis, value engineering, it's very hard to find people who are focused on it. Like if you search on LinkedIn VAVE, you'll find a handful of people that come back with that title in comparison to every other engineering role. And in truth, we all need to be thinking about it. People argue we do, but not to the extent that's really necessary. So how do we really make cost reduction engineering led? You look at the market today and the pressures we're having, these targets are getting more and more aggressive, and there's not a real strategy to get there except for the target's getting higher and we need you to hit it, is pretty much the emphasis most companies make. Most companies focus on workshops as the source for, crowdsourcing ideas. But the hard part then is on top of that, is usually limited to several people because it's expensive to fly people around. And then someone's just characterizing all these issues, putting them in the list, trying to figure out what to do with them, trying to remember the context of the discussion of all the sticky notes that were on the whiteboard. And it's really not making it effective for having a good, innovative discussion. And at this point, how you do cost reduction is critical, because if you're not reducing the cost of making your product better, both for the value for your customer and the cost basis for your company, you got to cut costs somewhere else. And that means you have two choices. You're cutting people mostly, or you're deciding not to make that next hire, which is limiting your capacity of the company. Targets are increasing every single year, whether you make them or you don't. If you make them and you're figuring it out, great. If not, you're having a compounding effect of how ambitious those things are, and then you're never really getting there, and it starts to distract you from the rest of your new product development work. So there's three things you can really do here. First one is you need to have a place that is conducive for anyone to be able to participate, not just a couple of people that typically go to workshops. It needs to be accessible with the context that people can go there and actually contribute right away and be heard. The second is a shift from workshop-centric to workshop-augmented. There are places where you will want to fly people together for maybe a major event or spend a day together on a video call. But a lot of times that's the wrong way to go about it. The more continuous this is, the easier it is for people to do when they have an idea or they're in the moment or something came up to share lessons learned, the better it's going to be. And the third one is going virtual. And by that, I mean going beyond just Teams. Teams is not enough because it's the same problem as a meeting room. You need to make it so that people have the information at their fingertips, the same way as if they had, a part of a chassis in their hand, looking at it and saying, how can I reduce the weight of this component? Or how can I take this down from 100 components to 50 components to save in manufacturing cost? Then you need to automate the admin. If the admin work is not automated, engineers are not going to volunteer to do this. They're not going to sign up to do more. And then it becomes somebody else's job and they're chasing people every day. So making it so that it's accessible and automating the extra work is a critical part to make it accessible. And I think a really awesome example of this is Johnson Controls in the industrial equipment space. They had this vision when COVID started that, we're not just going to survive COVID. We're going to figure out how to build better products at a better cost during COVID. This was an opportunity, which was a completely different lens than most companies took at that time, where they said, we're not investing in anything. So the way it was set up, very similar to most companies, in-person VA events beforehand, travel adds up. Only a few people can do it because you're going from, the US to other countries or bringing people together. And ultimately, all the documentation after is just on somebody and it goes into a black hole that is hard to keep track of. With bringing this into this virtual environment, making it continuous, they're able to do way more events. Now, it doesn't take the same setup. The event doesn't need to be a week. It could be 2 hours. It could be asynchronous. And way more people can be involved. I've seen them when there's been 50 people involved across an entire product org for an hour. And that 1 hour has produced twice as many high quality ideas as a full week would have. You've got way better engagement and people actually have fun. People feel like they can engage and be involved in that process. And the beauty part is at the end of the day, all those ideas can be tracked right in context. So if you say, maybe we can change this bolt hole pattern to 5 bolts or a more standard flange or whatever it might be, that's right there in the context of your 3D model. It can be taught into your drawings, your bills of materials, whatever it is, and nobody's worried about that admin work. And the ultimate impact of that has been cutting out a massive travel expense, almost 4x engagement across the engineering group, twice as many high quality ideas. So not just ideas, high quality ideas. So duplicates are being reduced, people are being engaged, thinking about things that haven't been thought about before. Review times go from weeks to days, and ultimately they're hitting massive targets year after year, and people aren't drove nuts about going through the process. More people are wanting to be part of doing this. And that's a huge cultural shift. So when you sum all that up into the DNA of those types of engineering teams, in the example of Kraken, Mobis, Johnson Controls, there's many more. But there's a couple of key things that tie those all together. And it all starts with the leader. It all starts with the engineering leaders who are in those companies. Because without them, change is absolutely not going to happen. And if you look at Kraken, Mobis, Johnson Controls, there was a manager or a director or maybe both in each of those companies who had a vision and who weren't afraid to get ahead of the market and say, even when times are tough, we're doing this. We're going to focus on getting short-term value. But we're going to do it the right way for the long term. And that today has set those companies up to be moving way faster than their competition. When things are really tough and you go through a recession, now they don't need to have quite so many people, and they're not in the same pinch that their competitors are. The second one is that they've adopted an effectiveness mindset, and they've challenged what they should be doing altogether. So they're doing the right things first and doing the right things right. When you take that and you couple it with really investing what I'll call the machine. So if you look at go back to the example of a vehicle company, how they build vehicles is almost, or maybe even more important than the vehicle itself. As you can see by the example of the Model 3 and the Cybertruck, it's really hard to tool up and mass produce a vehicle. Investing in the machine of how you design products is equally as important as the actual product that comes out. So teams who understand that how you work as a competitive advantage are the ones that are making these investments and deposits and getting to that new working potential. They're then doing it differently. They're not starting at the end where they're only through a transformation in technology. They're starting with the people and saying, what is a problem in this space that we can solve right now that will help us get towards that end goal, that behavioral change, that big rock we're moving. So they're thinking big, starting small, iterating, and growing that solution. And that mindset gets more people involved. It sees wins, it shows ROI, and it doesn't require a 4-year implementation period to just figure out that a tool did not work. And the last part, which is probably the most important, is that although they're thinking big and they're thinking about the company and these big macro topics of cash flow or product delivery or time to market, whatever, they're still in touch with what the end user suffers with day to day. Because if you're just passing down some massive change to an end user and you haven't thought about how they work, how it makes their life better, you're not getting the engagement. And then you're pushing change versus the end user pulling change. And when that happens, you see a snowball effect. And that's what really will drive the next step in that growth. So investing, in what matters to the business, but then also thinking about the end user is a critical part in making that happen. And what I'll leave you with here is just a simple question. Does your team have that DNA of a highly effective engineering team? And for most, you probably won't today. And that's okay. Being aware of where you're to is huge. If you've got a couple of them, that's huge. But the next step is what you do from here. Do you go back and go back to it just works? Or do you start challenging in the toughest times what we really should be doing and how we should be doing it, so that when the next recession comes along, you're already way ahead of everyone else?